For this video, I've compiled a series of edited video clips from some of my previous conversations with well-known online atheist content creators. Before each clip, you'll see the name of the person I was speaking with, along with the date of the original video. I've listed links to the complete original videos in the description.
But as me an atheist and you're a Christian, and we mentioned that Muslim and there's a Hindu out there. If I'm a truth seeker and I'm trying to figure out what is actually real, not just what makes me feel good, not just what gives me meaning and purpose, not just what helps, all that stuff, good stuff. All that stuff is good. But if I really want to know what's real, it seems to me you're in the same boat as the Muslim, as the Hindu, as the Buddhist, who uses faith as a reason.
Well, we're all in the same boat. For most of what we can tell is real. In fact, what I like to say is that I don't believe in God because of what we don't know yet, the God of the gaps. I believe in God because of what we do know. What I have seen from what physics, cosmology, even some aspects of quantum mechanics and particle physics, what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle tells me is that scientifically there are things we cannot know. Okay, we cannot know the momentum and the position of an electron at the same time. Research will not answer that question. That is a known unknown. I think there are many of those. And as we go deeper into biology, I think we're going to start hitting some of those as well. And that doesn't mean that God is there. What it means is that what you're saying is it would be great to know that something is really true or not really true. But the problem is we can't do that. We can do it a lot. Okay, we owe our modern civilization to how much we are able to do that. But we can't do it for everything.
Right, and I agree. It's an asymptote, right? Like, here's truth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I guess
we'll never quite hit,
especially with your scientific background,
truth,
I agree with that. Why sort of? I agree with that. I guess put them in different categories. I guess for me, and maybe you can tell me.
That's a good question. It's a good question, and I don't know if I have a great answer because I am like you. I like to know as much as I can, and I'm fine with uncertainty. And so what I have to do to explain it is get away from the whole issue of knowing and into the issue of feeling just for a minute. We can leave it after that. But what I will tell you is when I got through crying that moment in my car from joy, the joy has never left me since then. And when I go to church, and I go every Sunday, and almost every time I walk into that church, something inside me says, "What are you doing here? You don't belong here. You don't believe this stuff. You're a scientist. You're a rationalist." And I sit in the church, and the music starts, and people start greeting each other, and the pastor begins to speak. By the time I walk out, the joy is back, and that's a feeling that I've never had before. And I know in that sense, all right, not in the objective, verifiable, evidentiary sense, but I know in my soul that God is real and that Christ loves me. And, that's a feeling that I would not be able to give up at this point. To me, the big problem is the origin of evolution, because evolution, as we know it, requires a very specific biochemical mechanism, which is the translation process, where the genetic code informs the ribosome and all the enzymes involved to make specific proteins, and that's what allows evolution to proceed. Because if you don't have a really good link between genotype and phenotype, then evolution can't work. because you need to have the target of selection, which is the phenotype, has to come from a very close linkage of the genotype, which is what gets inherited. So that's necessary. Now, that could have evolved to some extent, but what I don't get is, how do you evolve a system which is in charge of evolution?
Okay, well,
I'm not saying it's impossible.
when
but
we
it's
talk about,
difficult.
just for the sake of layman, we
Okay.
seem to be, in the course of this conversation, when you're talking about the beginning of life and the emergence of the first genetic material and so forth, we do seem to have a couple of different contexts, because one definition of evolution would be descent with inherent genetic modification, and so you
Right.
have to have genes to start with, and so
Exactly.
the translocation and everything that all has to be underway. Not that
That problem is a big problem, and I think there is good evidence. It's not really evidence; it's really good theories that there was a form of life before the kind of life we know, which is based on DNA and proteins, and that form of life was based on RNA, the RNA world idea, and that has some logic because RNA can form catalysts like proteins, and it also can replicate. Doesn't do either one very well, but it's possible. So that's the consensus theory in the field as far as we can go as to how molecular biology began. So there are problems. There are problems in how you get to RNA world and how you go from RNA world to modern life, which is all the same, by the way, all from bacteria to us. Those mechanisms are all the same. So we know that there was a common ancestor. We call him Luca, last universal common ancestor. The Luca is well characterized because it contains those features that are present in every cell on the planet, and as far as we know, have always been present in all cells on the planet. And those features include DNA, they include ribosomes, they include a translation system, they include a number of very specific enzymes that must be there, a membrane. Certainly. Okay, that's Luca. We don't know how we got to Luca, and we might find out. I'm not saying that that's impossible. But it's not going to involve what we know as evolution, because it doesn't. You can't.
Well, adding to what you're saying, I mean, when you're talking about the Luca for prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and I have a different place. I begin at a slightly later position.
Well, that's okay.
It's not an evolutionary process. The endosymbiosis, where
Right.
eukaryotic cells envelop rickettsia bacteria to then convert that into mitochondria.
Right.
I mean, these are not evolutionary processes. There
No.
are different processes at work. But just because it's not an evolutionary process, or because it's an unexpected process, or even a complex process, I don't see. And I understand you said you don't believe what you do because of the gaps. So it wouldn't be fair to say, well, I don't understand how to explain this, so I'm just going to throw my hands and say that it was magic, which is what so many other people do. And they do the logical fallacy that if you can't explain it, therefore God, which God is not an explanation. That's just an excuse. That's just a default.
It's a big mistake for Christians to do that, and I'll just say that to any Christian who might be watching this. The mistake to do that is if you base your faith, your belief in God and Christ on a gap of knowledge, what happens when that gap gets filled?
Exactly.
What do? You say, oh, well, I was wrong, and you walk away from the church. And gaps have been continually being filled. So, you have to be very careful about that.
And I would just like to add one more thing. Another argument that I frequently have dealing with creationists is trying to get them to understand that whether God exists or not, evolution is still a thing, that we can still prove that's real.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Now,
I actually see evolution, and I say this to other Christians, as one of the great majestic works of God. Because if you think about how evolution works, it's beautiful. People talk about intelligent design as, God designed something and made it. Well, that's kind of like what a smart person would do. Maybe not even a smart person, maybe just a regular person. God is not an intelligent designer. He's not an engineer. What I believe is that like so much of the universe, when it came to life, we have this amazing system of evolution which is able to generate so much diversity. It's able to generate us from think about where we came from a batch of chemicals. Is he agreeing with me or you?
I'm sorry. There's people in the house. The dog's going off. Yeah, I apologize for that.
That's all right. I thought maybe he heard about evolution and he decided, yeah, that's where I can.
No, it goes with what I've tried to explain to a number of people. I mean, which is more, which is a better example of intelligent design? Somebody who magics up each individual species, or somebody who devises like a Mendelbrot sort of program that takes care of all of it itself.
Yes,
so it's an automated system.
I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm with you. That, to me, it's not proof of God, of course. We'll get to that in a minute, but that's an indication of something wonderful.
I don't believe any of the miracles in the Bible happen. I don't think that's reasonable to believe. I grant pretty much everything else about the natural explanations about Jesus' existence and the empty tomb and the people seeing him after he died or claiming to have seen a vision of him or whatever. But I don't think it's reasonable to believe any of the miracles actually happened based on the Bible.
Okay, so miracle is an interesting question. So let's say we were having this discussion. It wouldn't be online. It would be probably sitting in a house somewhere. Let's say we were having this discussion in 1880. And I had some kind of a crazy vision that someday we would be able to have cell phones and computers and things that operate, and there would be radioactivity, all these things that operate on quantum mechanics, on the principles of quantum mechanics. And you asked what that was, and I said, well, it's interesting. It turns out that the whole idea that if you want to go from point A to point B, you have to pass everything in between. It turns out that's not right. You can jump directly from A to B, especially if you're a packet of energy. You would look at me and say, well, that's superstitious miracle nonsense. Then you'd be right. It would be at that time. Well, it's not. It's now part of science. So I think that to say you don't believe in miracles is legitimate, but we don't know what's a miracle and what isn't, do we?
Absolutely, I agree. So let me make it a little more specific. If I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe, because we have lots of implicit empirical evidence of dogs. There's lots of things about dogs we know about from science, even if I don't mention them explicitly in the statement, like their taxonomy, phylogeny, genetic makeup, chemical composition. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. And the reason it wouldn't be reasonable is because it doesn't have an implicit empirical basis. There's no background knowledge about science that supports it. So from my perspective, no amount of testimony is reasonable to support anything that lacks an empirical basis, which means miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, UFOs. No amount of testimony can justify belief in those things until you provide an empirical basis for them.
I don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus and all the miracles that are in the Bible in the same way that I believe that genes are made up of DNA. I believe them both, but in different ways and for different reasons and with different epistemologies. I think that depending on what it is we're talking about, there are different appropriate and legitimate epistemologies. Now, when you're talking about the miracles in the Bible, you're talking about something that you believe happened, but it's something outside, not part of natural reality. That's the definition of a miracle. So you can't say that I'm going to see whether a miracle is real, because by definition, it's not real according to, it's not repeatable. It's not objectively verifiable. It's not something you can subject in a laboratory, because if it were, it wouldn't be a miracle. It would be part of nature and just a new facet. So quantum mechanics, for example, is not miraculous, it turns out. You might have thought it was when I first described it to you, but it turns out no, it's part of physics that we never understood, and in fact still don't, but at least we know it's real. So you see that distinction? It's why believing in miracles doesn't bother me because I'm believing in them. It's a belief. It's a faith. Those things.
Yeah, I totally agree. There are definitely different epistemologies to apply to different contexts. I think that
Right.
the way I phrase it is that conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence.
There you go. You said that much better than I did.
Introduce the topic for tonight and our guests.
We're going to go back to a topic that we kind of addressed a while ago. I actually had this discussion with John Perry from State of Clarity clearly on is DNA a code. We decided to get two actual experts in this topic to kind of suss out this, if it is a code or isn't a code, and if it's more than just a linguistic thing or a heuristic approach to trying to explain to people how DNA works. So we have Dr. Cy Gart back. He's been with us a few times. He's a biochemist. And we have Dr. Herman Mays. He was in the discussion with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, reviewing his book that he read twice, Dr. Jeanson, twice. I don't know how you want to start this off, because I know both of you guys' positions. People know I do side with Dr. Mays on this particular issue. But Cy, do you want to kind of maybe jump in and from your perspective, why you don't think DNA is a code, and then Dr. Mason kind of address it, and we just kind of go from there.
Well, it's reversed. I'm the one who does think it's a code.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You think it's a code. Dr. Mason doesn't think it's a code.
Yeah, okay.
You think what you want. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it might be more appropriate if Herman goes first, because I mean, I can say some stuff, but basically the idea of DNA being a code is fairly accepted, or has been up until maybe fairly recently. It's still listed as a code in all the various textbooks. In fact, I would say it's even mentioned in the Bible. No, not the Holy Bible. I mean what I consider the Bible of molecular biology, which is Molecular Biology of the Cell by Bruce Alberts. And the other textbook that talks about DNA being a code is that I have, there may be many, is Genes by Lewin et al. And there are a lot of, I could read off a bunch of quotes from both of those. Even no less a figure than Richard Dawkins has talked about the code of DNA, not recently, but in one of his earlier books. So I think the burden of, I mean, I'd love to hear what Herman has to say. I wouldn't say the burden of proof, because I don't think we're going to prove anything, but I don't know what the argument is, so I don't really know what to say.
Okay.
So if he wants to start, that would be great.
Well, I mean, of course, in all those books, in Genes, which is a classic multi-edition book about molecular genetics, and virtually any textbook that you can find at every level, every web page, not just any web page, but you could go on the National Institutes of Health and the Broad Institute, and pretty much any place of professional geneticists, they all call DNA, coding DNA, a code. And what we're talking about here is not just any DNA. We're talking, I think, at least about DNA sequences that are transcribed into RNA, messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA is then translated into protein molecules. So that's a very small percentage of any organism's genome. But the code that we're talking about is this relationship between specific sequences and specific amino acids in a protein. So we're only talking about coding, what's called coding genes. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I think that is important to remember, and actually, and I don't know if I've made this clear or not before, but I think that's fine. I mean, you have to call what we're yeah, I mean, I told Steve I told Steve when we he pitched this before between myself and Cy that I think that there's not going to be a lot of daylight between us on this. Now, what I would say is I think it's fine, but I think it's fine because you have to call it something, right? We talk about nature. The only way that we're limited to talking about nature using language. And so we have to ascribe words to natural phenomena that we are studying as scientists. The problem is language did not evolve to describe things like DNA molecules. So our language is very inadequate often for studying the things that we study as scientists, because science has advanced to the point to where we can address questions that are very far beyond our everyday experience. But at the same time, we're forced to talk about those things using language that was developed and evolved for entirely different purposes. So we have to call it something. And, you know, a code is, you know, about as good a word as we can come up with in our language without inventing some entirely, you know, you can invent some word that only refers to these DNA molecules.
Agree with what Herman said. Codes that we're familiar with are like language, or like cryptological codes, or, you know, programming language, are human based. They're based on human thought, intelligent design, so to speak, because we are intelligent creatures who design these codes. DNA is not one of those, and that, I think, goes to a lot of what Herman was saying about using the same word, because it's pretty close, but not exactly the same as how we first define codes, and that's true. But there are things about DNA that really do appear code-like, and we have to remember that outside of the genetic code in life and everything we do, there's almost nothing else that we know of that is so much like a code. And so what evolved was not just DNA as a storage of information, but an entire system of translation of the information in the DNA, which is a sequence of bases, nucleotide bases, into information on the proteins, which is a sequence of amino acids. ACT, which is a 3 nucleotide, what we call a codon, is the code for one particular amino acid, which I think is threonine. I used to have it memorized. I kind of forgot it, but and that's the code. That's where the code is. And how is that code translated to a very complex system involving a lot of molecules, like transfer RNA, messenger RNA, and some amazing enzymes like amino-acyl tRNA synthase, which actually combines the two chemistries and sticks them together, literally. It's a remarkable system. It's a remarkable process. If creationists are going to say God exists because DNA is a code, we will say, rather than the right argument, which is no, that's not a logical conclusion. The argument, the bad argument is, well, no, DNA is not really a